Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Michael Suarez, and as the director of Rare Book School here at the University of Virginia, I have the privilege of welcoming you and of introducing our speaker for this evening. But before I do that, I'd like to thank the Fralin and the East Asian Center for their help in helping to make it possible for Beth McKillop to come here and be among us this week. Like tonight's moon, which the likes of which won't be seen again for another 69 years, that's the rest of most of our lifetimes, but not everybody in the audience, I hope. Beth McKillop is a once-in-a-lifetime phenomenon, too. If ever there was a dynamo who could get things done, that person goes by the name of Beth McKillop. She has degrees or professional certificates from 5 different institutions of higher learning. From 1981 to 1990 at the British Library, she was the curator for Chinese collections, adding responsibility for Korean collections in 1983. In other words, just 2 years into her job, she took on a whole new field. Then from 1990 to 1993, she was seconded from the British Library to the Victoria and Albert Museum to create London's first gallery of Korean art. This included, and I don't feel sorry for her one little bit, trips to Korea in order to acquire contemporary Korean art for the museum, to forge connections and to secure sponsorship, something that she did so well. For those of you who don't know, it's sponsored by the Korean government and by Samsung. The V&A's Korean Gallery was the last addition to the V&A's museum galleries, to their Asian galleries. Its collection spans the Three Kingdoms period to the present day. And under Beth's leadership, it recently acquired some modern and contemporary Korean artworks, that from the Korean newspapers of this year. Between 1993 and 2004, she returned back to the British Library as curator of Chinese and Korean collections, where in addition to all her usual duties, she was, most regrettably, I might add, in my view, the manager of all the departmental planning for the gigantic move of the British Library from Bloomsbury to St. Pancras. Imagine moving the largest library in the world, because that's what happened. And all the Asian materials made that migration across the city under Beth's supervision. Edwin Rommel would have been envious, I think. What an astonishing thing. In 2004, the V&A brought her back again across town, this time as Keeper of Asia. What a great title. To be the Keeper of Asia and the Director of Collections, a post that she held until 2010. In this capacity, she led a team of 15 curators responsible for collections and galleries relating to the arts of India, the Islamic Middle East, China, Japan, and of course, Korea. She opened up the Jamil Gallery in 2006, and its success led to a touring collection of exhibitions on Islamic art that's been going strong ever since. She was able to secure funding for externally funded posts in the Iranian and in the Korean collections. She secured a deep relationship with the Nehru Trust and moved things around very successfully for educational purposes as part of the World Collections Program. China Design Now in 2008 at the V&A was Europe's first comprehensive study of Chinese architecture, fashion, and graphics in the Reform era. No wonder then that in 2010, she was made the deputy director as well as the director of collections at the Victoria and Albert Museum. As deputy director, she was in charge of 7 collections departments, as well as research, as well as conservation departments, and she had senior responsibility for both national and international institutional strategy. She supervised more than 200 staff, with a combined salary exceeding £8 million per annum. And she was in charge of the quality of the museum experience for 3.7 million visitors annually. What an astonishing thing. Now, in addition to co-authoring a book on Korean ceramics, Beth is highly involved in trustee work. As for Asia House, the Mumbam Educational Trust, and the Percival David Foundation of Chinese Art. The bibliography of her publications and exhibitions runs to 5 pages in 10-point type. Just how she does it all and does it with such sprezzatura and grace, I have no idea. But it's my tremendous pleasure and privilege to introduce you to tonight's speaker, Beth McKillop.
Well, thank you, Michael, for these excessively kind words, and I need not say, I'm sure, that the achievements are always those of a team, and that it's my great pleasure to be at the Rare Book School and, in fact, to meet Michael for the first time, having contributed to the Oxford Companion and having had the pleasure of feeling part of a global inquiry into the history of the book. I'm particularly pleased also to see my friend and colleague Dorothy Wong in the audience here tonight, and to welcome Dorothy's students in the audience, and to say a big hello to all the Rare Book community who've welcomed me so very warmly. Thank you very much for allowing me to join you in Virginia and for listening to a few thoughts about the history of the book in a distant land. And before I go further, I should put my watch down because I need to keep an eye on the time as we go forward and leave plenty opportunities for some questions at the end. You see on the screen in front of you a map of the Korean Peninsula, a historic map which of course doesn't offer an accurate outline of the long north-south trajectory of the Korean landmass, but it's a map which perhaps gives you some small hint of the people about whom we're going to talk today. People for whom books were of immense importance, people whose abilities in producing books, in making paper, in printing in different manners, and in collecting and studying books were admired by their neighbours and whose achievements are truly remarkable. This map, and you can see the city of Seoul at its centre, as well as Jeju Island in the south, and the great White Mountain at the north on the boundary with China, the Yellow Sea here to the west, and the East Sea to the east. This map reflects this diligent, hard-working Korean ethic with its manuscript notes all around it, helping the officials who used it to know what to expect when they went on their rounds and found different parts of the country with different populations, products, and so forth. Maps and map-making are a big part of printing in Korea, and this particular sheet comes from the great Kim Chung-ho, who was a practical map maker, a topographer who walked the country and recorded what he saw and made a monumentally enormous sheet map of the country. Here again you see the city of Seoul, the capital, with its east-west trajectory in the center, and it's one of the many incredible products of Korean bookmaking. But today, before I turn to talk about Buddhism and Confucianism, the subjects that I've promised for this lecture, I want to take a few moments to introduce you to what Korean books look like. They look very different to books that we are used to in our everyday life. And I'm going to begin by showing you a book which is in the collection of the Wellcome Library in London. It's a book about medicine. It's a very unexciting and very mainstream, practical, useful book that one would find in a library in a non-elite household in Korea. This book has an oiled paper cover, so you can see this thick Korean paper, dyed this kind of musty yellow color and impressed. It's a thread-bound book. Korean books are very different from Western books in that they open in the opposite direction to what we're all used to. They come down this side, and they have sewing holes here. Here's the next side of this book. Its back cover, and here is its first page. Koreans were thrifty, austere people who looked carefully at the use of materials, so they reused scrap paper to thicken and to protect the outsides of their books, and they weren't particularly precious about the appearance of their books. Once you actually get into the text block of a book, you feel very far away from Western book styles. We're here with many students from the rare books community who are giving deep attention to pages printed by Western presses. Well, the way of producing books in East Asia was very different, and before all else, one had woodblocks, and these woodblocks, like this, would make an impression on the paper, and it's through the study of these woodblocks and measuring their size and their features that bibliographers study the book in Korea. So here is a first page on the left, and a last page on the right. We're reading this book from right to left. You'll notice that the pages are folded down this side. So each page is printed only on one side of the paper. Again, very different from Western books. Easy in this technology to create illustrations. What we're looking at here is a book of medicine, of practical instructions and reference for doctors. So if you want to take a few lines out to create an illustration, pretty easy to do so just by carving the block a bit differently. The book is also different from many Western books in that its soft covers give it a pliability and flexibility which made an enormous difference to the availability of books in pre-modern Korea. Western books were often protected by heavy, thick covers. They weighed a lot. Before the dissemination of paper in Western countries, the medium for printing was animal skin, which was expensive, thick, and unwieldy. The availability of paper in Korea and in China was an enormous spur to the spread of literacy and of practical books around the country. So you see in a book like this, a very heavily used, heavily thumbed, rather roughly treated work. And you see how very easily malleable and wrapped up its pages are. The Korean book page, again, has great flexibility in its layout and typography. You can see here rows of text coming down in normal size, and then you can see annotations in half size. You can see the page number, and you can see the running title coming down the side of the paper. When we describe Korean books, we also look carefully at the sides, the edges of the woodblock, which have been used to print them. If it has one or two borders, if these borders are the same, or one thick one, one thin one, all of these features help us to study, describe, and compare the different editions of books which circulated. An important part of Korean book design is this rather charmingly named fishtail, this little device here, which helped the printers folding the paper to catch exactly the right line all the way down. And these fishtails were designed in different ways, sometimes in talus and sometimes the other way around, sometimes with three little rice grains here, or sometimes with 4. So again, we look at these and we describe them and can distinguish between different editions in that way. Here's a few more illustrations just to show you some more ways in which this woodblock is so widely used. And you'll notice also the particular features of Korean books with their large upper margins and rather smaller lower margins. This is different from Chinese and Japanese books, and for anybody who looks after an East Asian collection and is sometimes wondering which of the 3 countries the books come from, that's a quick indication of which way it might be. This book, by the way, is about 25, 26 centimeters tall. Just letting you see more of that. Then margin annotation, found quite frequently in Korean books, as in all others, handily available. Sorry, going the wrong direction there. And this sense of the narrowness and the lightness of the book is something which I think strikes anybody who's been more familiar with a different book tradition in the past. So, let me just find my place. The woodblock is the most common way of producing books in Korea, and this particular example has been helpfully painted in white. I don't quite know why or who by, but this woodblock is in the British Library's collection and allows us to see the mirror carved text upon its surface. And the text is a literary work from the 15th century by a gentleman called Pak Sang-chung. And here you can see where the text has been printed onto paper, minus the margins, and it looks extremely uncomfortable and unfinished without its margins. So here's the woodblock. You can see the fishtail in the center, you can see the double borders, you can see the running title down the center, and then you can see the printed version. But not all books in Korea were produced with wood blocks, and Korea's eminence and distinction in publishing and printing cultures really comes from the extraordinary development of movable type printing at a period quite some time before such technology was used in Europe. The Koreans needed books for various purposes. They became Buddhist during the first millennium, round about the 5th or 6th century AD. And as is so common in religious transmission, change of belief pattern stimulated and encouraged printing to carry the messages of a new religious tradition to a people with whom, to a people who are not familiar with it. These Buddhist texts, on the whole, were produced between about 600 or 700 AD through to the 14th or 15th century, mainly using carved wood blocks. But at times, Koreans found it more useful or more practical to cast bronze types and to make books using these cast types. And here you see some examples of these cast types, and they were laid out in trays, just to look like the characters on a printed woodblock. Everything I've shown you until now has been not in the Korean language, but in the Chinese language. And I'd like to say a few words about those two languages. Korean is totally different from Chinese. It's grammatically different, syntactically different, and it's a reflection of China's potency as a cultural center, that so much printing in Korea in pre-modern times was done in the Chinese language. The educated elite in Korea studied Chinese pretty much as the educated elite in Europe studied Greek and Latin. And Chinese was the language of the upper class and of scholarship. But during the 15th century, a new alphabet was artificially devised and published, and many books were produced thereafter using this new set of letter forms, which nowadays we call Hangul, Hangul. Thus, we've got a book tradition which uses carved woodblocks. It uses metal type. It takes advantage of a long-standing paper-making tradition based upon primarily the bark of the paper mulberry tree, but also using many other paper sources, including rags, rice kernels, and straw. So here's the paper making, and here's paper out to dry. And we end up with a large book-producing enterprise spread across the country in different places, both in temples, which needed to use holy text, Buddhist scriptures, and also at court, where the kings of Korea required particularly Confucian texts for their courtiers and their officials to model themselves on the sagely ways of ancient China. So Korea was a country that always had a thirst for knowledge, and the modern Koreans who made this kind of diorama of printers at work revere their country's past and are proud of the printing traditions that it reflects. I'm now going to break off from these generalities and go through some particular landmarks and some particular high points in Korean print history. This is a picture of a very important temple in the southern Korean city of Gyeongju, Down in the far south of the country, there was a kingdom called Shilla, Silla, and in that kingdom, a Buddhist temple called the Buddha Land Temple, Pulguk is Buddha Land, was built in the 8th century. And inside that temple, there is a pagoda. That pagoda stood for many hundreds of years until, in the 1960s, it was opened, and inside it was found a Buddhist reliquary. And in that Buddhist reliquary, which included jewels, bottles, and the supposed remains of Buddhist saints, inside that was a tiny little printed sutra. And I have a facsimile of that sutra, which I'll be happy to show you later on. It's tiny. It's only about 3 centimeters across. And it's a set of the text that you see there and a reconstruction of the block from which it was printed is a set of incantations seeking the blessings of the Buddha upon the people. So by that time, by the mid-8th century, and we know when this temple was built, the Koreans were capable of producing a lengthy text and of carving a woodblock to make it, and of making the necessary ink and making the necessary paper. And of course, it's in scroll form, which was the precursor of the folded page book that we saw earlier on. The next major landmark I want to draw to your attention is this extraordinary book, which was published in the 14th century, in 1377 to be precise, and it is produced using metal movable type. And we know that because the colophon tells us so, and this book is the world's earliest dated book printed using metal types. Gutenberg is mid-15th century, this is late 14th century. But this is not the earliest Korean movable type. We know from literary evidence that in the 13th century, there were other books printed using metal movable type. And again, we know this because of the practice in books of including a colophon, which gives a few notes about why the book was published, who edited it, what they thought when doing so, and in many cases, on whose behalf the book was published. It might have been published to help the soul of a departed parent, or to ask for the blessing of the Buddha upon oneself. So very often these texts have a few helpful lines that give us some detail about their printing history. This book is particularly interesting because it highlights modern Korean nationalism around their print history. The book is 1 volume of 2. It's familiarly known in Korea as Jikji, but actually the text is it's a Buddhist text, a Buddhist sermon, and it's in the collection of the French National Library in Paris because it was collected by a French diplomat in the late 19th century, and then lost from view for quite a long time until rediscovered in the late 20th century, at which point the Korean population became very interested in it and rather keen that it should be sent back to Korea from Paris, something which has not happened. So that's a great landmark in world printing, the first piece of literature, the first substantial work to be reliably dated that was published using metal movable types. But I think equally remarkable and equally memorable in world printing history is the so-called Tripitaka of 80,000. In Korean they call it Palmangyong, and in English we say Tripitaka of 80,000. That is the Buddhist scriptures contained on 80,000 woodblocks. And these 80,000 woodblocks are housed in this remarkable temple complex at the temple called Haeinsa in southern Korea on Mount Kaya. And this is a world monument, a UNESCO World Heritage Monument, and I would strongly recommend any of you who ever have the opportunity to visit it and see it. It is quite a remarkable survival. These are the woodblocks. They're carved on both sides. They are 3.5 kilos in weight each, and taken as an ensemble, there are over 52 million Chinese characters carved upon them without a single mistake. And they are a testament to the devotion to Buddhism which swept Korea during the period from about the 8th century AD through to the time of the Mongol invasions in the 13th century. The whole history of this set of woodblocks is like a romance or an adventure thriller. The stories of the saving of the blocks from being burned, they're being hidden and then being moved away into this mountain fastness, really could make quite an exciting film. And here is a single sheet of Buddhist text printed from these blocks. And again, I have a facsimile to show you later on. This set of Buddhist scriptures was the second time that the whole Buddhist canon was printed on woodblocks in Korea. The first lot was lost during invasions of the country. The second time around, it was better, and they have survived until modern times. I couldn't leave the topic of Buddhism and books in Korea without mentioning a bit about manuscripts as well. I've only talked now about printing, but Korea is also a land of a very accomplished manuscript tradition, and manuscripts would be produced using very fine brushes on particular kinds of paper. And one could talk for a long time about the relationship between painting and manuscript and writing, painting and calligraphy, but we'll just quickly mention this set of amazing, rather tiny manuscripts. This is only about, I think it's about maybe 17, 18 centimeters in height. You'll see it's in concertina format, and you'll see that the first two leaves you see there are a frontispiece, and then there's a text coming. This is a Buddhist text which is in the collection of the British Museum. It's a sutra devoted to the Buddha Amitabha, and it's dated, although you can't see the date on that slide, to 1341. There was a scriptorium, there was a royal copying room which produced manuscripts in considerable numbers for king and courtiers. And again, this was driven by the belief that if you paid money and instructed a scribe to make a Buddhist text for the benefit of the soul of somebody you loved, you would be doing a good thing and bringing merit to yourself and to that person. So many, many times these Buddhist texts have a few lines at the end explaining for whom they've been copied and whose idea it was, sometimes even naming the copyists or the person who had commissioned it. So this, as you notice, is a blue manuscript, and these sorts of manuscripts are on very fine indigo-dyed paper, and Korean art has a great preponderance of contrasting material objects, both in mother of pearl inlaid into dark lacquer and in coloured clays inlaid into ceramics. Koreans are very fond of contrast and brightness and this kind of dramatic difference in colours in a work of art. And so this kind of manuscript tradition is very strong in Korea, but also found in neighbouring countries. My final piece of Korean literature about Buddhism is a most touching and astonishing work called The Sutra of the Profound Kindness of Parents. Now, Korea is a place where Buddhism and Confucianism come together, and Confucian values very much emphasize children's debt to their parents and the needs for society to be ordered in a hierarchy where each of us knows our place, and the son is loyal and obedient to the father, just as the minister is loyal and obedient to the king. So in order to bring in these ideas, which were foreign to Korea and came from China, popular books were published, like this one, and you'll see that there is both Chinese script and the local Hangul script. And that local script, the Hangul alphabet that I was talking about, that was designed for use by ordinary people. It was explicitly and deliberately intended for people who were sort of semi-literate, not going to rise to great office, not going to be members of great families, but who needed to be able to change their ways, learn how to behave properly, and so on. So the ordinary people had books like this published and helped along their way by including the local syllabary in it. So what you can see here is an apocryphal Buddhist sutra. The original Buddhist canon does not contain this work. It pops up in China and then becomes very popular in Korea because it's a kind of syncretic effort bringing together Confucianism and Buddhism. And you can see here, I think, a mother washing a baby here on this side. And on this side, you can see a sad mother watching her child go off with an umbrella. So this shows the great kindness and support that parents give to their children because the mother is so upset to see her child go away. I don't know. Now, moving away from Buddhist books, I want just to talk a moment about the idea of the sowon, the private academy. And these were centers of learning that were established around the country in the dynasty after the Great Buddhist dynasty. The Great Buddhist dynasty is known as Koryo and goes from 918 to 1392. The succeeding dynasty is known as Joseon and goes from 1392 up until the 20th century. And during that later dynasty, the Choson dynasty, the noble families would educate their sons in places like this, scattered around the country, led by a philosopher or a teacher, and devoting themselves to the studies of the classics of Confucius. Confucian classics were also very much studied by ministers and officials at court, and the need for good editions of these books played an important part in the print history and the publishing history of Korea. Here we can see a 15th century text, which I think you'll agree is much more readable, elegant, and well-designed than the books we looked at earlier. And this is produced using metal movable types in the time of the great 15th century king Sejong, who ruled from 1418 to 1450. And we know from the historic record that Sejong took a close personal interest in the technology of making these books. There are records from the court annals of the king inquiring about how the production of these books was coming along, making sure that they were finding ways of doing it efficiently, and they moved from settling the individual pieces of type with beeswax to wedging them in with cloth, and they found better results. All of this is detailed very clearly and practically in the court records of the time. And this king, King Sejong, is the person who actually invented the Korean script, the Hangul script. And here is the book whose title is The Correct Sounds to Educate the People, which promulgated, which announced this alphabet and explained why it was needed. It's a fantastic script, and I think it gives you just a little bit of understanding. If you look at where my pointer is, at that right-angled sign, that's the Korean letter K. And the script actually mimics the movement of your articulatory organs in your mouth as you make the sounds. So K is a tongue against the hard palate at the top of your mouth. And later on, we can see down here, M, which is the bilabial sound, and the symbol invented for it has a sort of imitating feature. So the Hangul alphabet, again, is one of Korea's great claims to fame. I may be wrong, but I think Korea is the only country in the world that has an alphabet day, and they have a national holiday to celebrate the anniversary of its promulgation. And here's another moral tale, which is for ordinary people to improve themselves. And yet again, here we see a lady who is, she's first of all cutting ice and then generally looking after her parents. She's being very devoted to her parents. The text is given once in Chinese and then in the upper margins in Hangul. So books for common people, books to kind of promote correct behavior, get the treatment in the local script. And finally, I'm now stopping, but modern Korea is alive with excitement about print history. And this year, in the city of Jeongju, they made this extraordinary structure, this huge building and festival, in order to tell the world about how innovative and ingenious Korean people of the past were. And it may not look like it, but these squares are blown up character pieces which have been used architecturally. So just to finish up, I'd like to say that in Korea, a complex legacy of Buddhist, Confucian, and other codes has been inherited in modern times. We've looked in these slides at Haeinsa, at the UNESCO listed temple in the south. We've looked at Buddhist printing as a treasure of world civilization. Today, South Korea is also a leader in digital networking, and Korea is a country that understands books, ideas, and how to circulate and study them. The things I've shown you tonight refer to the period between 750 AD and about 1700, really almost a millennium. All of the books I've shown you use local materials, paper mulberry trees, birch wood for blocks, charcoal for ink, bronze and other metals to make cast types, in ingenious ways, making books of many different kinds and qualities as the economy required. Our world is becoming more and more globalized, and I think that East and West need to respect and understand each other's book histories more deeply. I hope that listening to a few words about Korea's achievements in book history may be part of this process. Thank you.
Would you take a few questions?
I'd be happy to, if there are any. Dorothy? Yeah.
You did mention that woodblocks or metal cast blocks were used, both types were used.
Mm-hmm.
Were the metal types mostly exclusively just for movable type, or were they cast in the block as well?
They were lined up. I should have a slide of that, and I'm afraid I don't, but they were lined up in a tray. Yeah. And it was a difficult matter to get them to be even and flat and properly aligned. And we can read in the records about how hard it was. And yeah, they did eventually conquer it and design type. I think you call them founts, do you? With an awl-shaped bottom, so that they could be squashed down and wedged into place.
So regarding the earliest one, the one found underneath the pagoda.
Yep.
And I know they relate to also the earliest printed text found in Japan.
Yep.
The Akumako Darn.
Yes.
So there have been theories as to whether the Japanese one were printed from woodblocks or
Yeah.
not woodblocks.
Yes.
So what about the Korean?
The Korean one, well, this is the little facsimile of it. The examination of the surface of the text leads you to be pretty sure that it's printed from woodblock, rather than in Japan the emperor, I call them the emperor shotoku. They're quite short, and they're just not as substantial as this. And they're also, this is really long, yeah. We will look at it in a minute. But I should say that this has been the subject of some controversy between Korea and China, with some Chinese scholars asserting that it's impossible that this would be published, this could be printed in Korea, and it must have been printed in China and moved to Korea. But it becomes very difficult to be objective about these things, but I believe that examination of the historical legacy of 8th century Korea would demonstrate that this kind of technology was entirely within their reach, and that the paper, as far as one can see, resembles Korean paper, which I haven't talked much about, but Korean paper is quite distinctive and was well known in East Asia for its, particularly for its long fibers and for the practice of hammering it to produce a very smooth surface. And so Korean paper often is thought to be denser than paper from neighboring countries, and of course it exists in quite a wide variety of materials. So it's in a lecture like this, it's very hard to generalize accurately, but it definitely has long, wispy fibers which give it great tensile strength. Yes?
I was wondering, when you compare print history of Korea and, let's say, Germany, I think that maybe Germany's print tradition took off in a phenomenal way because their focus was on the masses rather than the elites, whereas the Korean tradition was more exclusive, focused on the elites rather than the masses.
I have struggled over this for many years, because I think at first when you look at technological innovation, you somehow expect the new technology to replace the old technology because it must be better. And so you think, well, movable type is somehow an advance on woodblock printing. But in the Korean context, I don't think that's the case. I think that both woodblocks and movable types were useful for different purposes. Woodblocks were cumbersome and heavy and needed to be stored, and were, in the East Asian tradition, valued because they preserved the text for posterity. Once carved, the text is there and can't be changed. And in the East Asian tradition, I think that's extremely important. The correctness and the reliability of the text. The movable type episode in Korea, in my way of thinking about it, is connected with the Mongol invasions, when everything was turned upside down and normal business didn't go on. The country was laid waste to. So they had very good metal workers. They knew how to cast coins. They knew how to cast bronze bells and cymbals and gongs, and they had very fine metal workers. So they just turned their hand to making metal types. And they did that for books they needed in small quantities, and they did it during the period of the Mongol invasions. But once that period past, they didn't use metal movable types consistently in future. The great period of metal movable types was in the early Choson period, and that was really for court use, court reference use. And then around the country, for books produced in larger numbers, the woodblocks kept going. But the other part of your question is about books for the elite and books for common people. And I think in Korea there were books for common people, but they were special kinds of books. They were books to teach people basic literacy and books for practical purposes. And then these kind of moral books that I was showing, like books that teach you how to be a filial son, or books that teach you how to, give examples of meritorious conduct. But the idea of universal literacy didn't really have much currency in early Korea. I don't think anybody in pre-modern times would have considered that a particularly desirable thing, because Korean society was very stratified, and there was the elite, and then there were, at the bottom, there were the base people, and in between there were merchants and farmers. But the idea of being born into a social situation and remaining in that social situation throughout your life was accepted as fate, really. Michael.
Since you're a museum deputy director and a curator, what do you think about the wisdom of repatriating this absolutely crucial document from the Bibliothèque Nationale de France back to Seoul?
Well, with my museum director's hat on, I suppose I would say the collections that a museum owns are legally its own, and it's for the museum to decide whether or not it would like to deaccession them. In the case of France, they have their own laws and structure, so it's a decision that they must make. And in fact, the French have repatriated a big group of court manuscripts which were brought to France during a punitive raid on Korea in the mid-19th century. And they are now in the National Museum of Korea, and they've been displayed and so on. So it can happen, but what else? What do I think? I think in some cases the great universal museums of the earlier times need to be more alive to the emotions of the countries of production of some of their collections. But it's a very, very charged question, because if you were to begin repatriation of the objects on grounds of, on grounds of national sentiment, then, maybe you'd have to send the Elgin marbles back to Greece, you'd have to send all the Benin bronzes back to Africa. And I think the fact that these questions arouse such powerful feelings on both sides of the debate to me, it demonstrates that there is not a right answer to this question. I think the best outcomes are ones which are done by mutual consent, and I don't know if the French authorities have had a request for that to go back. But one thing is for sure, it matters more to Koreans than it does to French people. The number of people in France who are capable of reading that and understanding its meaning is very small. But the French cultural realm takes its responsibility very, very, very seriously. And their idea of patrimony includes the French experience around the world. And so, I feel uneasy about saying that they ought to send it back. Yes?
Many of the texts that we looked at both included Chinese as well as Hangul. And
Yeah.
so I'm wondering at what point, if there is such a point, that the Chinese was no longer included.
No, there is not such a point. Chinese just goes on and on and on. I think it's to do with the power and the prestige of the Chinese language. Hangul was kind of thought of as something for lower people and women. You know, Hangul was okay for women, but, you know, for real people and prestigious people, Chinese characters were best. Good.
If I may, before we leave, I want to give you a little commercial announcement, and that is that Beth McKillop will be giving the Whedon Lecture, co-sponsored by the Fralin Museum and the East Asia Center, on Thursday, the 17th of November